Welcome to our community forum regarding the alternative scenarios to the TOD SEP. My name is Will Adames. I'm Council's Community Engagement Coordinator, so everybody welcome. First of all, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. Now, this evening's going to run with a 45-minute approximate presentation. And during that time, you can post any questions you like in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. What we will look to do is address those questions at the end of the session, and hopefully we'll be able to get through every question. Just please note that we're looking at generic questions about the scenarios. We're not looking to address specific questions around individual properties. If you do want those kinds of questions addressed, you can write to us to our email address, and I'll provide that later on, and I'll put it in the chat as well. You can also come along to one of our drop-in sessions and you can talk to staff. They can go through any queries or questions that you might have. The first one is happening on Monday, the 2nd of December, from 5 till 7 p.m. at Council Chambers here in Gordon, 818 Pacific Highway in Gordon. And there's also one on Saturday, 7th of December, 10 till 12 at Gordon Library opposite the Council Chamber. So hopefully you'll be able to get all your questions answered. You also posted a number of questions when you registered. We've done what we can to address the key themes, and the majority of those that came in during the presentation. But again, feel free to add any other questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and hopefully we'll be able to address everything. If we can't do everything, we'll have a record of the questions and we'll look to post things in the coming days. So I would like to hand over to Bill Royal, who is the team leader of urban design, who will go over the alternative TOD scenarios, give a background to the project, and hopefully that'll give you enough information to ask us lots of useful questions, and hopefully by the end you have a much better insight into what's going on. So Bill, if I can hand over to you.
Yes, thank you, Will. And welcome everybody. Thank you for your interest in this important project. Tonight I'll take you through some of the background information that we've been looking at over the last few months. I'll take you through planning principles that we've developed to guide the preparation of the scenarios. I'll also give you descriptions of the scenarios, and we have a video as well tonight which has a bit of 3D information which will hopefully help people visualize the scenarios. Also just next steps after this. So what is the TOD? The New South Wales government has put in place the TOD SEP, which now applies to land within 400 metres of Gordon, Callala, Linfield and Roseville rail stations. We've estimated it impacts on approximately 4,800 individual dwellings, including 551 properties of heritage significance. It also spans over an area with an average tree canopy of about 35%. The TOD SEP applies blanket provisions across an urban area that contains a unique combination of soils, topography, vegetation and built heritage. So the TOD doesn't really recognise those characteristics. It allows 6-storey apartment buildings and shop-top housing buildings across the zone, across the areas. It also offers an affordable housing bonus, which would allow a 30% increase in height, taking buildings up to about 8 stories. So why are we doing this? Council has asked us to explore alternative scenarios to the TOD SEP, with the main objectives being to protect heritage items and conservation areas, to protect trees and tree canopy, and to meet the dwelling targets stipulated by the New South Wales government for the TOD program. We've undertaken our own due diligence and worked through to calculate what we think the number of new dwellings that might come from the TOD over the next 15 years. Our estimate is 23,200 dwellings. The New South Wales government released figures in August this year, which were 22,580 dwellings. There's only a 2.7% difference, which is a very minor difference. So we think we're pretty much on track with our estimate of the dwellings. We've adopted the figure of 23,200 as the target. The study area. Our study area has included the Todd development area, which is the 400-metre radius. We've also expanded it to include an approximation of what the low and mid-rise SEP development area might be, which is out to about 800 metres from the rail station. This approach is also consistent with Council's definition of a local centre from the Ku-ring-gai strategic planning statement. This map shows the Todd SEP in white areas in the middle, which is in the 400-metre radius, and then the expanded boundary in yellow out to 800 metres, which is basically our investigation area. We've undertaken detailed constraints analysis across a range of areas, including heritage, biodiversity, slope, riparian, bushfire and tree canopy. And most of this has been based on Council's current statutory local environmental plan and also development control plan provisions. In terms of identifying alternative locations for housing, Council's constraint analysis has identified suitable locations where housing could be transferred to so that heritage and tree canopy can be better protected. We've overlaid our constraints maps, and this map shows a summary of those, where the brown areas represent constrained land, so that would include heritage conservation areas or heritage items or land with biodiversity. So these are areas where we need to be very careful in terms of how we treat these. The white areas are the unconstrained, what we'd say is unconstrained for housing. And you can see that a lot of those areas are around Linfield, within close proximity to the centre, also in Gordon. There's also areas to the north of Gordon and the western side of Roseville. Planning principles. Following on from the constraints analysis, we have developed a set of 7 planning principles which have been used to guide the preparation of the scenarios. I'll take you through those now. So principle 1 is to avoid environmentally sensitive areas. Council's alternate scenarios will avoid locating high density area residential in the following areas. That includes biodiversity, riparian lands, and bushfire prone lands. Principle 2 is to minimise impacts on heritage items. So wherever possible, the TOD controls will be removed from areas with high concentrations of heritage items. You can see on the diagram on the right, Linfield, this is the TOD boundary in black. This is Linfield Station, Killara Station, and the TOD boundary in black. The difference between Killara and Linfield, the purple representing heritage items, is that there's a very significant concentration of heritage items around Killara when you compare that to Linfield, which is largely free of heritage items. So wherever possible, heritage items, the scenarios will be retaining heritage items within a low density environment. And this will be achieved by transferring dwellings to alternative locations. And of course, this outcome varies with each scenario. Where heritage items are proposed to be within high density residential areas, they will be given the same or similar development rights as adjoining properties. This means that properties could be sold to a developer in the same way as adjoining properties, and incorporated into an amalgamated site. Within the development site, the heritage item could be reused for housing or communal facilities. And the details of this would be managed through site-specific controls in both the local environment plan and the development control plan. There are examples of this in Ku-ring-gai, and one example is shown there in Cecil Street, Gordon. So the diagrams here illustrate principle 2. On the left-hand side is the TOD scenario where heritage items are left out of the TOD. However, there's on 2 or sometimes 3 sides have properties that now can redevelop for 6-storey apartment buildings. In the scenarios, we will investigate how heritage items can form part of amalgamated development sites where the use of building height and setbacks, the heritage item can be incorporated within the development. Principle 3 is to protect heritage conservation areas. So council scenarios will protect HCAs by transferring the potential dwelling yield to suitable non-heritage areas. The TOD controls will be removed and the area will revert to low density housing. The degree of protection varies across the scenarios, which I'll take you through later. The diagrams here show the TOD scenario in the red, where HCAs have been within the TOD area have generally allow 6-storey apartment buildings now. However, under our scenarios, we will transfer those potential dwellings to nearby areas, particularly the commercial areas along the highway and the railway line, and protect the HCAs within low density residential zones. Council's resolution required us to look at scenarios that partially protect HCAs. So in this case, HCAs are selected on planning considerations rather than heritage considerations. And the reason for that is that all HCAs from a planning point of view are considered worthy of protection. So in terms of which selecting areas to not protect, to be consistent with Council's resolution, we've used the following considerations. The first one is to avoid HCAs with a high concentration of heritage items, as I showed you in Kalara. The second is to avoid HCAs that are located more than 200 metres from the rail station. And we also will try and avoid HCAs that are contiguous with adjoining HCAs. And you can see here this in Gordon as an example of an HCA which is separated from the other HCAs by a road. So we would call that non-contiguous. Principle 4 is to protect the tree canopy. The TOD has very minimal provisions for protections of tree canopy. And it also has a high density or floor space ratio. So we expect there to be significant impact on the tree canopy as a result of the TOD. We want to improve that protection and replenishment through planting of new trees in high density residential areas by reducing density when compared to the TOD set. We will also introduce deep soil site coverage and setback controls similar to Council's current DCP. This will require more building height or more spread to accommodate the same number of dwellings. Principle 5 is to manage transition impacts. One of the things that the TOD, one of the impacts of the TOD is that it finishes in the middle of a block, right next to a single dwelling. So in this example, the red shows sites that fall within the TOD, and the blue show properties or houses that are outside the TOD. So the road is running around here, and these houses are left right next to sites that could develop to 6 stories. Our response, wherever possible, is in this case would be to extend that zone to the road, so you have a clear boundary from high density to low density on this side. So yes, the idea is to use existing or new roads, lanes, or open space as that boundary from the transition boundary from high density to low density. And the degree to which we can manage these impacts varies across the scenarios, which I will describe. Principle 6, we want to ensure appropriate building heights. So the Ku-ring-gai centres sit within a context of between some regional centres, Hornsby, where there's building heights of 120 metres. Macquarie Park also has 120 metre heights. Chatswood has heights up to 250 metres. Epping and Dee Why are 70 metres. So we would see the Ku-ring-gai centres as being lesser height than those centres, given their place in that context. We also want to see that building heights reflect the role and hierarchy between the centres. So Gordon is a bigger centre than Killara, which in fact Killara hardly has, it has 1 or 2 shops. And we also think increasing building heights in the centres will protect HCAs and tree canopy. In terms of building heights, we will also look to focus the greatest height centrally, close to the train station, on key sites and council's community hub sites. We would also look to transition height from the greatest at the centre out, decreasing as we head out to the edges. Principle 7 is to support local centre revitalisation. So part of this is promoting mixed-use development that incorporates retail and supermarkets to address the undersupply of retail across the LGA. We'd also want to support redevelopment in the key sites and the Gordon Civic Hub, including the Gordon Civic Hub, Linfield Village Hub, and the Gordon Centre. And this will require appropriate building height and FSR. We'll also look to utilise council land for the delivery of community infrastructure, such as new libraries, open space, and community centres. I've shown here some examples of, this was a development in Linfield Avenue, which provides, it's got 2 supermarkets and multiple small retail outlets. It's added a lot to the centre, and nearby is the Village Green, which was a council car park, which council used to develop open space. The housing scenarios. So we've prepared 5 housing scenarios. Broadly, they sit within 3 groups. So scenario 1 is the existing New South Wales government controls retained. Scenario 2 are sort of minor variations to the TOD, and 3A and 3B are more significant changes to the TOD. Scenario 1, existing New South Wales government controls retained. This is council's interpretation of how the TOD might be realised over the next 15 years. The TOD is a blanket control applying to most properties except for heritage items. We have estimated that about 40% of the area will not redevelop due to factors such as ownership, strata title, or financial feasibility, and we've shown that as white or blank on the following map. We think that redevelopment will occur primarily in the low-density residential areas, including within the HCAs, and that's shown as light brown on the following map. So this diagram shows scenario 1. We have Roseville down the bottom, Linfield, Killara, and Gordon at the top. So as I said, blanket 6-storey building heights across the whole area within 400 metres radius of the station, 23,200 dwellings and zero protection for HCAs. So, as I said, the brown areas represent where the TOD controls apply and where we think the sites will redevelop. The white areas represent those areas where we don't think redevelopment will happen, even though they are included within the TOD. And the examples of this include the western side of Gordon, where we already have 5-storey apartment buildings that have been built in the last 5 years. We think are very unlikely to redevelop. A similar thing on the western side of Roseville, where there's 5-storey apartment buildings. Similarly, on the eastern side of Linfield and around Drovers Way, Linfield. We also have large school sites that we don't think will redevelop. And we don't think a lot of the commercial areas within the town centres will redevelop either. And that's due to development feasibility. In terms of building height, Gordon and Kalara, they're all equal to 6 stories. You can see here where the brown areas, the missing teeth, as we call them, these are all heritage items. So you can see how the TOD controls apply and don't apply to heritage items and how these become stranded and surrounded by apartment buildings. The heritage items are shown, heritage conservation areas are shown in that hatch colour, and they extend across the whole eastern side of Kalara. So potential development throughout that conservation area and on the eastern side of Kalara. This similar for Gordon, where there's areas of conservation area that will redevelop, and the similar for the eastern side of Roseville and small areas within Linfield. Assessing scenario 1 against our 7 principles, we've given those a red cross against each of them. Scenario 2A is we've called safeguard and intensify. So this option safeguards 78% of HCAs and about 60% of heritage items by removing the TOD controls from those areas. The dwelling yield is transferred to other suitable areas within 400 metres of the rail stations, primarily to the commercial areas along the highway and around the station. Improvements in tree, canopy and heritage protection are achieved by transferring dwellings from HCAs to the commercial areas. We've also introduced a new high density zone with 50% deep soil and flexible controls that allow us to plan around heritage items. This diagram is scenario 2A. So the heights range from 5 to 25 stories. So 5 stories is the minimum height within these. This is the new blue zones that we've included to replace the TOD zones, up to 25 stories in Gordon in that dark reedy brown colour. 2A stays largely within 400 metres. There are some extensions outside that where we're addressing interface and transition issues. 23,200 dwellings, so matching the TOD and protecting 78% of HCAs. Overall heights are in a hierarchy, with Gordon the highest at 25 stories along the highway and over the rail line. Linfield 15 stories along the Pacific Highway on the western side, and Roseville up to 12 stories on the Pacific Highway and a bit lower on the eastern side on Hill Street. Kalara the lowest at 10 stories. Conservation areas hatched. You can see in 2A where there's most conservation areas are protected. However, there are small areas, so this one's between Khartoum and Robert Street, HCA included within the development area. Small areas in Kalara on Marion Street and Stanhope Road, and small areas in Linfield, Beaconsfield, Middle Harbour, and broader areas in Roseville on the eastern side between Lord, Oliver and Roseville Avenue. Scenario 2A, this is our assessing against our principles. We've given it a tick, green tick, against all of them, so it achieves all the principles but except for preserving heritage conservation areas, so it preserves about 78%, so that's somewhere between a red cross and a green tick. Scenario 2B, so this represents minor amendments to the existing New South Wales government controls. This scenario largely retains the TOD controls. In selected locations, the TOD controls are removed to protect about 31% of HCAs and about 10% of heritage items. Retention of the TOD controls results in lower buildings in the centres compared to other scenarios. However, it impacts more heavily on heritage and canopy. There are some minor extensions outside the TOD area to address some transition impacts. However, the limitations of this option make it difficult to address all those issues. So scenario 2B, heights are 6 to 15 stories, so 6 stories in the brown TOD zone and up to 15 stories in these orange areas, up to 15, 8 to 15 in the orange zones. Stays largely within the 400 metres with some minor exceptions in these areas where we're addressing interface. It meets the 23,200 dwelling target and protects about 31% HCAs. So you can see in Gordon, St John's Avenue, HCA is fully protected. There's other areas on the eastern side that are not protected. In Kalara, there's only some parts of the eastern side of the conservation areas that are protected. The rest would allow development through those. Similarly on the eastern side. In Linfield, we have smaller areas where the TOD controls would be retained. And in Roseville, most of the eastern side of Roseville, the TOD controls would be retained with small area conservation areas on the edges protected. Overall building heights, Gordon has the greatest height, up to 15 stories. Kalara stays at 6 stories. Linfield up to 15 stories, particularly mainly on the western side of the highway along the Pacific Highway. And Roseville a maximum of 8 stories, mainly on the western side of the Pacific Highway. Scenario 2B, because we retain the TOD controls, it's very hard to minimise impacts. However, it does achieve Principle 6, so we've given that a green tick. And in terms of local centre revitalisation, it would go some way to that by encouraging development. Scenario 3A is preserve and intensify. This option preserves 100% of HCAs and about 80% of heritage items by removing the TOD controls and transferring dwellings to areas within 400 metres of the rail station, primarily to the commercial zones. Improvements in canopy protection and transition impacts are achieved by transferring dwellings from HCAs to the commercial areas and by introducing a new high-density residential zone with 50% deep soil. There's added protection given to the smaller centres by transferring dwellings from Kalara and Roseville to Gordon and Linfield. So Gordon and Linfield take more of the share in this option. So in this diagram, we see scenario 3A. So the height range is 5 to 45 stories, so down to 5 stories in some of these blue areas, up to 45 stories in this very dark brown colour. So staying largely within 400 metres, with some exceptions to address transition impacts. And we have 100% HCA protection. So you can see in the case of Killara, the entire eastern side of Killara, the TOD controls are removed, as well as the other smaller conservation areas on the western side. Similarly, in Gordon, all conservation areas have the TOD controls removed, and in Roseville and Linfield. The heights, so Gordon has heights of up to 45 stories, and that's mainly on the western side of the Pacific Highway, with heights of 16 to 25 stories in nearby locations, as well as the railway, mainly along the Pacific Highway. The blue is the new residential zone, so those areas are 5 to 8 stories with 50% deep soil and flexibility to allow us to plan around heritage items where they have been left within those zones. There is a few locations where the TOD controls are retained, and that's in some locations along the highway where we have older strata title apartment buildings. Scenario 3A ticks most of the boxes. Principle 6, ensure appropriate building heights. Building heights of 45 stories are equivalent to what's over 120 metres. So that's the sort of height you might expect at Macquarie Centre and Hornsby. We've said that's not necessarily appropriate for Ku-ring-gai. Scenario 3B. So again, we're preserving 100% of the HCAs and about 80% of heritage items. We're removing the TOD controls, and in this case, we're transferring dwellings to both within the 400 metres, but also beyond 400 out to 800 metres of the rail stations. Dwellings are also transferred from Killara and Roseville to Gordon and Linfield to protect the smaller centres. Improvements in canopy protection and transition impacts are achieved by introduction of a new high density zone with 50% deep soil. Scenario 3B is here. The height range is 5 to 20 stories, so 5 down as low as 5 stories in the blue zone, up to 20 stories in the reddy brown areas, primarily in Gordon, extending out to 800 metres, and you can see that in Gordon. So the new zones extend down to Vale Street and on the western side and out to Carlotta Avenue on the northern side. Similarly, Killara extending out to the north and south, Linfield out to the west and a little bit to the north, and Roseville a little bit out to the west on the western side. All conservation areas are protected. In fact, in Gordon, most of the eastern side of Gordon is protected as low density residential area. Overall heights 20 stories in Gordon, Killara 6 stories, Linfield 15 stories mainly along the highway, western side of the Pacific Highway, and maximum of 8 stories in Roseville. So we've given scenario 3B a green tick on all those principles. So that's the end of the description of the scenarios. Just a quick visual summary of building heights. This just illustrates the scenarios along the bottom, 1, 2A, 2B, 3A and 3B, and how building heights have been managed. Gordon is always the tallest centre, with Linfield the second, Killara third, and Roseville third, Killara the lowest heights. again, heritage conservation areas. This is the percentage protected across the scenarios, 1, 2A through to 3B. So there's no protection in scenario 1. Scenario 2A is up to 80% in Gordon and Killara and about 50 to 55 in Linfield and Roseville, about 30% in 2B, and then 100% in the other two. This table just puts together all 5 scenarios and shows you the ratings that we've given them. This is a video that I'll show you now. We've only just completed this, so this is first time seen. It'll be loaded up onto the website and you'll be able to look, move through it quite slowly and have a good look. I think it gives a good indication of how heights and spread move in and out with each of the options. I can come back to this during question times if need be. This is showing Roseville moving from scenario 1 to A. Roseville scenario 2B. Roseville scenario 3A. And Roseville scenario 3B. Moving on to Linfield, scenario 1, Linfield. Scenario 2A, Linfield. Scenario 2B, Linfield. Scenario 3A, Linfield. And finally, scenario 3B, Linfield. Moving on to Killara. Scenario 1, the Todd set. Scenario 2A. To B, Killara. Three A, Killara. And 3B, Killara. And finally moving on to Gordon. Scenario 1. To A, Gordon. To B, Gordon. Three A, Gordon. And 3B, Gordon. Oops. Apologies for that. So just to finish up, the next steps. So where are we now? So in October, Council adopted the draft scenarios for public exhibition. We are here, so we've just started public exhibition as of Friday last week. That'll run for a month to mid-December, and from then on, we'll be reviewing the community's submissions and survey input, and preparing a report which will go back to council in the council meeting of February, which is normally around the 16th to the 20th. And that will include a preferred scenario, which could be one of the ones we've presented tonight, or it could be a combination of these. So it really depends on the feedback that we get. So that is my presentation finished. I'll hand back to Will. Thanks, Will.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you everyone for your attention. Now it's over to you. Now we've had 50 questions put into our Q&A box, and I will go through those. Now I've noticed some of them are comments and many are questions, so we'll try and address as many as we can. So if you can just be patient and while we go through them. What we'll do is I'll read or paraphrase some of the questions so we can get through it as quickly as we can, and hopefully we'll be able to answer them all. If we can't, we may have to take some on notice, but as I said, we'll aim to have questions and responses of anything we can't address on our website in the next few days. So the first question that came in bright and early at 6:32, and I'll just read this. In some of the housing scenarios, small number of houses are left stranded next to high rises behind the block. In one instance, there's one lone house left stranded in Roseville that is not heritage listed. How will council fix these before finalising the housing scenario with the state government? So, Bill, how are they going to fix these anomalies?
So our next step is to work through in detail. So what the scenarios are really, they're very illustrative and indicative. We need to work through the detail and actually start to prepare models showing buildings, and as part of that process we'd work through all those anomalies that might show up in the scenarios.
Thank you, Bill. Moving on to Ursula's question, why can't we spread the Todd load across the stations north of Gordon? This will help protect more heritage and stop high-rise 15, 25 or 45 stories. So why can't we spread it further north?
Yeah, for us as council officers, the terms of the council resolution were fairly clear. We had to work within the 4 centres. We also have to be careful about how, ultimately one of these scenarios has to be approved by the state government, and I think internally we agreed that probably that wasn't going to be an acceptable option.
Okay. Thank you. Next question from anonymous participant. How will the council manage heritage? Oops, sorry, my question's gone to the bottom. How will council manage heritage properties in these scenarios? Will council comply with their suggestion in council papers that isolated heritage will be delisted? So is there any delisting on the cards, Bill?
Not at this stage, no. So I went through the scenarios and talked about the percentage of heritage items that would be left, have the TOD controls removed, so left within low density, and then the remainder would be then integrated within a new high density residential zone that was that 5 to 8 story one that I talked about. So it allows for enough flexibility for us to integrate heritage items.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Next question, why has council not considered the assessed value integrity of HCAs to inform HCAs that should be kept and HCAs that should be abolished to allow for higher density? So consideration of abolishing some HCAs.
I might hand that one to Craig, I think.
Craig.
Okay, yeah, sure. No problem. Now, council over the recent months has taken a thorough analysis of all the current 28 HCAs that are affected by the TOD and those surrounding the TOD areas. That study concluded that all HCAs, subject to a few very minor amendments, actually still maintain the standard and the integrity to meet the local listing requirements under the Act. So based on that study, there are no inferior HCAs. There is some variations in the level of the intactness of some of those HCAs, but they all still meet the requirements for heritage listing.
Thank you, Craig. Next question: if the community feedback comes back to prefer scenario 1, will council look to make small adjustments to the TOD, e.g., don't leave any houses stranded, reduce density next to heritage listed houses, etc.? So will we accept that and make minor adjustments?
I think we've probably covered that in either 2A or 2B, really. I think that would be, they're both of those, well, 2B is a very minor amendments and 2A is a minor amendment, but it covers off on a lot more of the managing the transition impacts and impacts on heritage.
And as you mentioned earlier, Bill, it could be that we go back with a combination anyway of
Yes.
these scenarios. So I guess it's
Yeah.
a council decision, isn't it?
It is.
Lovely, thank you. Next question. Isn't it better to sacrifice a few heritage houses within the 400-metre limit to limit Todd's height to 6 stories and keeping it within 400 metres? Plus, you don't want to have heritage houses among high rises anyway. All proposed scenarios have greater height and extends out further and past 400 metres. The government proposal seems to be a better outcome. That's a comment, I believe. I'll just leave that as a comment. Next question: how does pushing development down the western side of the Hill of Gordon comply with bushfire assessment? So is there some issues around bushfires with any of the scenarios?
No, that's part of the assessment, so all the areas are not within bushfire-prone lands.
Great, thank you. Not all heritage items are worth keeping. Heritage house owners have assessments that support delisting. Will council consider the delisting of these items to open up more land for development? So I don't know if is that a comment, Bill? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I could probably jump in on this one, Will.
Thank you, Craig.
Yeah. There is a statutory process for delisting heritage items that does include, obviously, an assessment both by the proponent and council as well. So there has to be a review of that assessment. Now, people are able to commit to initiate that process themselves at the moment, but council hasn't made any formal decision to offer delistings.
Thank you. Thank you. Next question. How do council scenarios work with the government's low and mid-rise proposal for 400 to 800 metres? The scenario creeps past 400. Does this mean properties which are part of the TOD in the scenarios between 400 and 800 metres would not be part of the low to mid-rise set? I think this one's for you, Bill.
Yeah. So a couple of points there. So whenever we've extended outside the 400 into what will be the low and mid-rise area, we've made the height and densities greater than what will happen under the low and mid-rise. So the proposals in the scenarios would therefore be well, they're basically higher than what's in the low and mid-rise, so they'd not override them, but they would be more attractive. Then we also need to take into account the low and mid-rise because we don't know how it's going to play out yet, so it hasn't been released in those areas. But we've assumed that there will be a certain number of. We've assumed, based on what's been exhibited, that the way the proposals we've made will be greater and more attractive development outcomes.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Could I just, sorry, we'll just add another comment just on
Sure.
that one.
Yep.
The government has stated that the low and mid-rise will not apply within the TOD areas. But part of what council is seeking to do through this process is to identify alternate sources of housing, in which event the state government can then turn off the TOD as it applies in Ku-ring-gai. That would then open up all those areas within 800 metres to the low and mid-rise.
Okay, thank you. This is kind of a comment, but there's a bit of a question in there. Your list of constraints does not include essential traffic flow and other considerations. Now, Bill, have you got any comments on that?
Yeah. In terms of traffic, we don't know what the impacts will be, but we have studies underway now for all 4 centres that will assess the traffic impacts of the TOD, and that information will be available by the time we report back a preferred scenario next year.
Okay, thank you. Can I please know what methodologies you have used to come up with the estimated new dwellings in each suburb?
Sure. Yep. So, as I said, we think about 40% of the areas within the TOD will redevelop. So the ones we've excluded are strata title apartment buildings, especially where they're probably 15 years old or less. We've excluded apartment buildings where there's 10 or more owners, because we think that is unlikely to too hard to amalgamate that number of owners. We've excluded schools, churches, service stations. We've excluded most of the commercial zone. We've had feasibility advice that has told us that the TOD controls are below what is necessary to make for feasible development in the commercial zones.
Okay. Next question, very quick one. Does heritage items mean homes?
Yes.
Right. Nice and quick, that one. Scenario 3B meets all council's planning priorities. Does this mean 3B is the most preferred by council?
Well, council hasn't made a decision, so council's resolved to put all the scenarios on exhibition. As council officers, we've prepared those scenarios to achieve the best planning outcomes we can within the limitations. So it not necessarily is council's preferred option. We don't know what that will be until we've heard back from the community, and then that's put to council.
Great. So we hopefully will know early next year.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Re principle 3, if a heritage item was not part of an amalgamated site purchased by a developer, are there any other protections provided by the heritage property that could be surrounded? Sorry, provided for the heritage property that could be surrounded?
We're looking at putting in controls within the LEP, which would require amalgamation of heritage items. And we would look to include in our DCP site-specific controls that actually showed footprints and building envelopes and how the heritage items would fit in that. So we'll do as much as we can to make sure that doesn't happen.
Right, thank you. The next question, if Ku-ring-gai Council can fight the state government mandate for additional units, if Ku-ring-gai Council can fight the state government mandate for additional units will be good. However, in case this is not possible legally or from cost point of view, then what council should do is ensure distribution of new residential units are fair and not given favour to elite low density housing areas. The residents don't want to have monstrous high concrete up to 25 to 45 levels in our area. That's a comment. And we'll just move on to the next one. Bear with me. Not all HCAs are equal. An assessment of each heritage item in the HCAs will release more land for development. Will council be looking at this from a heritage perspective rather than the stated planning perspective? So are we looking at heritage again? Is this one for you, Craig?
Yeah, similar to the answer previously. The independent review we've had of all our HCAs does conclude that they are generally equal, and it's difficult to rank them, and that's why rather than looking at heritage grounds, the options or the scenarios we've come up with are more planning focused than just pure heritage focused.
Right. Okay, thank you. Next one is, in terms of Principle 5, it looks like council missed houses in scenario 2B. Will council be fixing them up? There are houses in Roseville and Linfield affected. That's maybe something that we can look at in more detail. Any comments on that, Bill?
2B, do you want me to go to the missed houses in 2B in Roseville?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we don't know what these are, so
Could be heritage items.
right. Okay. Maybe whoever made that comment, if you can, you could drop us a note. Send us an email to housing@krg.nsw.gov.au, housing@nsw.gov.au, krg.gov.au. Apologies. That would be great, and then we can have a look into that because at the moment we don't have enough information to look at that. Thank you. Does council consider that best practice planning actually delivers 8 stories across the road from a single story dwelling with no transition areas? I think we'll take that maybe as a comment.
I could. Yep. I mean, I think it's referring to the blue zone, this blue area. So we do say 5 to 8 stories. So it's not necessarily 8 stories. It's a range so that we can manage the densities and transition impacts better than we can if we just use the TOD controls, which has a fixed height of 6 stories and a fixed FSR. So
sure,
it gives us much more flexibility to manage those things.
Okay, I can answer this question. Can we obtain a copy of this presentation? We are recording this session and we will be posting it on our website hopefully tomorrow, so you can go through it at your leisure, and you will also be able to access the video. So we'll do that as quickly as technically we can. We know that all scenarios focus development on council-owned land. How likely is it that council will approve development of these? Also, where will the car parking and childcare then be situated? Does anyone have any comments on that?
No, it's because we can't speak for council, really.
So what council does in the future remains to be seen. Is that what you're saying, Bill?
Well, the opportunity's there, I guess, but we can't say whether, definitely the council will choose to take that opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Just on that, there is capacity on the council site to actually incorporate those range of uses on the one site.
Right.
What's proposed here is by putting higher densities on those sites doesn't take away council's ability to put those other supporting infrastructure on those sites.
Great, thank you, Craig. The principle to protect tree canopies and heritage buildings can be used just to protect the interests of the elite residents who are rich enough to live in low density housing versus the unlucky second-class residents like me who live in an apartment. What is a justification for protection for Clara and Roseville compared to Linfield and Gordon residents who will have to get bigger allocation of new units and high monstrous apartment buildings? So I think this is about equity in terms of where we're suggesting development should go. Bill, any thoughts?
Well, I think it's a fair question, but in terms of planning, the planning principles are to not put high density in heritage conservation areas or where there's a high tree canopy. And yes, that does mean that there's areas around Gordon which would then are more appropriate from a planning point of view to put those dwellings or that density.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. For alternative scenarios, does council have a default preference? I don't think you can really answer that one, Bill.
No, not sure.
So, but what I think the question is asking, do we have a preference? And I think, as you
I
stated earlier, we until we go through this process of hearing from our community, of looking at the results of this process of community engagement and consultation, and looking at all the scenarios, and it will be determined at a later date.
Yes, and a number of the scenarios could be, there could be tweaks made to those to make them.
Sure. Okay. The next one, to be fair for all Ku-ring-gai residents, my screen's gone funny, bear with me. To be fair for all Ku-ring-gai residents, the allocation should be distributed equally to all suburbs, and therefore we will only get up to 6 to 8 stories like in scenario 1 and 2B. We don't want 25 and 40-story buildings in our area, and it is unfair to get them in our area just to protect the rich, cushy areas in Killara and Roseville. I think I will take that one as a comment. How does scenario 1 lead to 0% HCA protection if heritage items cannot be redeveloped? And there are provisions regarding setbacks still in play.
So we would say that a heritage item that is isolated and surrounded by properties that can redevelop to 6 stories is not protected.
Right.
So,
okay.
Physically the building remains, but in terms of the amenity and the quality of the residents' lives in those buildings, it's definitely impacted.
Okay, thank you. If council considers heritage to be the key thing to consider and protect, why is council taking a planning-led approach to developing these scenarios? Why is council not actually investigating the abundance of heritage to understand what should be kept and what should be let go?
Craig?
Well, that assessment has been undertaken, and it reinforces that all of our HCAs are worthy of keeping. And as I also previously mentioned, if an individual item is in question on its significance or whether it merits a current heritage listing, then there is a process for investigating that.
Okay.
I'd probably add, to undertake a review of all heritage items in the time that we've had to do this would be impossible.
Yes, and
there's a limit. There's limits.
And we have to remember that the Todd scenario 1 is in place at the moment. Is that correct? Yes. The next question in 2A, which heritage items make up the 40% of heritage items lost? That's probably a tricky one to answer.
2A, so there's no heritage items lost. Oh, sorry, is it talking about heritage conservation areas?
It just says heritage items, which are different to heritage conservation areas.
So in 2A, we've said 78% of HCAs are protected and about 60% of heritage items. So there are HCAs that within the 20% of HCAs that are not protected would have the Todd would have high density residential allowable in those areas.
Okay.
And then the heritage items would be retained, but within a high density residential area.
Okay, thank you. The next one, in the alternative scenarios, some, e.g. 2A and 3A, have Burgoyne Lane Gordon as unlikely to develop, and others 2B, 3B, have shown 5 to 8 stories. Can you clarify why the difference and what is the rationale for unlikely to develop?
Yep. So I think I've touched on this before, but land that's unlikely to develop is shown in white, and these consist largely of apartment buildings that have been built in the last 15 years. And the Todd controls don't provide enough uplift for those buildings to redevelop. It also includes hospitals and what else does it include? There's schools, but primarily it's apartment buildings, either with all the owners 10 owners or more recently developed.
Sure. So you don't consider it likely that they will be developed because of what's there currently, or short.
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Because the Todd doesn't give enough uplift
To make it worth redeveloping.
That's right.
Okay, great. There's a bit of a statement here. How about fairness principle not part of council consideration? I think we just have to remember that the Todd scenario is in place now already. So these are just alternatives to that. Do you have any further comments on that, Bill?
No.
No. Okay, thank you. Why is Gordon tasked with 25-story building when the other suburbs can also share the load? How does 16 to 25-story buildings safeguard the suburb? And what are the environmental... Oh, sorry, my screen's gone strange. Bear with me. Sorry about this. And what are the environmental effects from overshadowing and wildlife disturbances? So why is Gordon having to take the load, and what's the impact of that?
Well, Gordon is the largest centre of the four. There is a lot of old buildings that could, and there's a lot of capacity for revitalisation. What was the rest of the question? Sorry.
How do these heights safeguard the suburb, and what are the environmental effects of the overshadowing and wildlife disturbances?
Well, we'll be looking into overshadowing when we do the detailed modelling. But really, the scenarios are just illustrating options for how council can achieve various outcomes. So the 25 stories in Gordon, if that's not preferred, then there's other options with lower heights.
Okay, so that's just one of the options. One of
the options.
Excellent. Okay, this is about HCA. So what criteria did council use to determine which HCAs to protect?
There are criteria set out in the Heritage Act on what thresholds need to be met to either be considered as a heritage item or a HCA at a local level, state level. So the review we undertook of the HCAs assessed them against the established Heritage Act criteria and determined that to a large extent that they all still meet that criteria.
Okay. In McIntyre and Merryworth Street, Gordon, we already have one heritage building inside 4 apartment buildings. What's the difference with the other ones that sound like precious items to be protected by sacrificing residents who live in Gordon? I think scenario 1 and 2B are the best ones in terms of fairness to ensure all suburbs get reasonable height new apartment buildings only up to 8 stories. I think that's probably a comment. Have there been any considerations of air and noise pollution, wildlife displacement, bird collisions, etc., that are commonly associated with tall buildings? Bill?
Not at this stage, no.
No, it's too early in the piece.
Yeah.
Okay. Will there be any compulsory acquisition of properties, or will these new buildings only be built when the current owners sell their property?
Yes. No. It's all based on purchase of land by developers and redevelopment by developers. So no. No.
Yeah. How seriously will council take the questions which are being raised? Well, that's what we do take the views of our community seriously, which is why we're doing such a broad piece of community engagement. Do you have anything else to add to that, Bill?
Yeah, I mean, I think we are taking it serious, and the fact we've put, 4 or 5 alternate scenarios on exhibition is giving people a very wide choice.
Right. Okay. Thank you. I'm not clear how an HCA is deemed protected when 8 stories are allowed across the road. How does council expect single-story dwellings to exist across a small road from 8 stories looking in on us? I think you kind of covered this earlier, Bill, If you can
Yeah.
just repeat what you said.
Yeah, so the blue areas are building heights of 5 to 8 stories. So that's really not saying that the whole lot would be 8 stories. It might only be a very small part, but it's to allow us flexibility to plan around trees and heritage items.
Okay, thank you. Could you please elaborate on what 50% deep soil means?
Yep. So under our current planning controls, this is something we have in our current planning controls. So what it means is that on a site, that there has to be 50% of the land area has to be left largely untouched and with nothing underneath it. So it means that you can't have basement car park underneath it. So it has to be a landscaped area with soil extending right down, down to the bedrock.
So this allows large heritage trees, yeah? Is that
it allows
canopy trees? Yes.
It allows large trees to be both retained or planted as well.
Great. So that protects some of the canopy. Thank you. Can you explain the deep soil contract? We've just done that. So we want to protect the smaller centres, but offload dwellings to Gordon and Linfield, and particularly to areas not on the prize streets. Are we protecting the environment of the suburb in general, or just in the HCA zone? So are we looking at protecting the broader environment, or just the HCA areas?
Well, we only do that in options 3 and 3A and 3B. That the transfer is only happening in those 2 options. So if that's not a preference, then there's 3 other options to choose from.
Okay, thank you. Does 3B comply with Council's promoted concerns about the Todd zones re-bushfires? That was Council's, sorry, my screen again, bear with me. That was Council's big concern about the developments proposed under the Todd. So I think you have mentioned bushfires, Bill?
Yes, no, it doesn't.
Right.
Yes, none of the new areas would go within bushfire prone lands.
How can we view environmental protection as not connected to the suburb areas at large? Protecting certain HCA areas, but affecting other parts of the suburb with tall buildings seems to still affect the environment. So I'll take that one as a comment. Why is Council not assessing the heritage value of each property individually to determine whether it's even worth protecting? This could free up more land and allow Council to focus on heritage areas that are actually important to protect. Craig?
I think it's Bill mentioned earlier, to actually assess every individual heritage item. Here we're talking about, what, 400 odd buildings is a very expensive and extensive process. We have done the assessment of the HCAs, which I've mentioned earlier, but it's just not practical to actually assess every single item within the resources and the time that we have.
Yes, and I guess going back to the point I made earlier, that the Todd is here already. Yeah. So it's not about something in the future. This is here and now. Basically, the residents of houses in Killara and Roseville are protected from high-rise buildings along with noise and crowd-related issues, but Gordon and Linfield can only blame their bad luck. Are we second-class residents in Gordon compared to Killara residents? I'll take that as a comment. Will we also be able to get hard copies of this presentation so we can digest the information at our leisure? We can probably print some copies of this and put it in our customer service area to peruse. And also you are, of course, welcome to come to our drop-in sessions and have a chat with us and go through things in more detail. Max heights of 6 stories is more palatable than 15 meters, which is the lowest max height of all the scenarios. Once we develop these sites to 6 stories, they won't be able to redevelop them to greater heights for a long time. Wouldn't this be a preemptive protective measure? Do you have any comments on that, Bill?
Not entirely clear what it means. The preemptive protective measure, I'm not sure.
So I think what it's saying is if we build to 6 stories now, then it will protect the buildings in the future because it will be less economically viable to rip them down and put higher buildings up. I think that's probably what it's saying.
Sure.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
probably a comment.
Yep.
HCAs within 400 meters should give way. I don't think increasing the TOD height is a better outcome. I'll take that as a comment. The graphics show more development in all of the non-TOD programs. How is this protecting the environment of the suburb as a whole? I think we've covered some of that, but Bill, do you have any additional comments on that?
I missed that. Could you just say that?
The graphics show more development in all of the non-TOD programs. How is this protecting the environment of the suburb as a whole?
Well, I suppose it depends on which scenario you're looking at. So scenarios 1, 2A and 2B all stay, and 3A all stay within the 400 metres. So there's not that much extension in those. It's only 3B.
I think what it's saying is that there's a higher density of development, but in smaller areas under the alternative scenarios than the TOD. And I guess the concern is that we may be protecting the heritage, but that's not perceived as protecting the environment as a whole. But I'll move on. Does council land become more valuable in the alternative scenarios?
I guess it would. Yes,
Yeah.
that's right.
Okay.
Yes, taller heights and greater FSR. Yes.
This was addressed early on in the presentation. Are developers able to get a 30% additional to the 25 to 45 stories if they incorporate additional social housing?
Craig,
Yes, that is the case. That those bonuses are under another state policy, so we can't turn that off.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
but it's affordable housing, not social.
Okay. Affordable housing. Okay. What is the address we can use to have our personal property questions? As I mentioned earlier, housing@krg.nsw.gov.au to make a submission or ask specific questions. I will share this at the end as well. What time frame does the development have to take place? Is this a 15-year bill?
Look, the government, when they released their figures, said 15 years. Yes,
15 years, right.
It could. It's the amount of zoning that change that's happened. It could easily extend beyond that.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, but just on that one, it won't be switched off after a certain time frame. Once it's in place, it's there.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Regarding the white-coloured properties unlikely to be developed that are within 400 metres of the station, like those on the northern side of Shirley Road, Roseville, why are they unlikely in all 5 scenarios? And will they be rezoned for higher building heights, even though they are unlikely? I think Bill covered this in the sense that it may not be economically viable, or the types of uses that they have now mean that they probably won't be developed. Is that right,
That's
Bill?
right. Yeah. And in the
Okay.
case of some of the larger strata apartments, the heights would have to be significant for those to redevelop.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Have you considered bushfire impact? Yes. There is enormous amount of stress on heritage homeowners with these scenarios. Will council listen to the feedback from owners to provide clear pathways for heritage homeowners?
Yes, we're certainly trying to make it as clear as possible.
Right. So and as I mentioned earlier, we're going through this process, so we are listening, and we want to make it as straightforward as we can. Next one, if a heritage listed property is within the unprotected HCA, will the heritage item be delisted? Craig?
Council hasn't made any decisions or commitments to delisting at this stage.
Right.
There are alternate processes that individual owners can go through to seek delisting.
Right. Okay. Will council make a developer acquire a heritage property?
Well, we can't make them, but the way we can set up the planning controls will certainly make it difficult for them not to acquire a heritage property as part of a development site.
Okay. Why didn't the council make fairness and equity a consideration principle proposing different scenarios? I think these are important factors. I think that's a good comment. No point, no, any views on that? I think that's is a bit of a comment there. Okay. Moving on, it's important to note, one, there are inaccuracies in the Heritage Report Council commissioned, and two, many heritage homeowners have commissioned assessments that support delisting. Considering this information will change the light reporting council commissioned, will council listen to these heritage homeowners? So there's some concerns about inaccuracy in our heritage reporting, and will we listen to heritage owners?
As with the study that we've done, the council hasn't made any decisions on whether to act on the recommendations of that study. And if individuals have their own heritage assessments, then there is a process to formally seek a delisting.
Right. Okay. How do you respond to the Sydney Morning Herald article? Alternatives won't work. Well, we're not sure if that's the case, and so we'll have to look into those in more detail. Is council looking to vote for a vote, or is it actually a consultation where council will read and consider all of the feedback provided? Now, we are doing a broad process of community consultation. So hopefully we will get a really clear picture from the community about what is the preferred direction, and maybe a combination of scenarios. So I think it's really up to the councillors to decide what they choose to do with the information provided. Will the government likely reject these scenarios because it's possibly unsafe traffic-wise to have the very high density all concentrated on Pacific Highway? Bill, do you have any thoughts on that?
I don't think that would be a factor for refusal. It wouldn't really make that much difference whether there's more housing away from the highway or not. They all have to enter the highway at some point or another.
Okay, thank you. What about infrastructure for another 23,000 new dwellings, sewerage, water, schools, community services, etc.? So any thoughts on additional infrastructure?
We're still trying to come to terms with it. It's a huge number of people. There is some discussion. There's a study online, a planning study online. At the rear of that, there's some discussion on the quantum of parks and sporting facilities and community facilities, etc., that we will need.
Yep.
However, the funding, we're still working through how that may be funded.
Well, okay, thank you. How have you established that there are no bushfire issues in any of the scenarios? I disagree, since I have lived in one of these areas and have experienced bushfire. So the bushfire assessment. Can you shed any light on that, Bill?
Well, our bushfire-prone map is the guide.
Right. Okay. So we've used existing work to determine what is or isn't a risk area. Okay, yes. Great. Will the white-coloured properties still be rezoned despite being unlikely to be developed?
So if any of these scenarios go through and are adopted by council and the New South Wales government, then no, those would then retain their underlying zoning. So in the case of some of the newer apartment buildings, they would stay as R4, right, high density. So no, they would retain their previous zoning.
Okay, thank you. How will council ensure heritage houses are included in amalgamations that are already underway? We have development next door already.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. And that's something we're very aware of, that there's a large number of sites that are up for sale or have been purchased and things are moving very quickly. So that is something that we have to be very aware of.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. How is the Todd area allowing subdivision of blocks above 450 square meters within 800 meters of the 4 stations in Ku-ring-gai, and how's it being dealt with in these scenarios?
The Todd only applies within 400 metres.
Right.
That sounds like that might be referring to the low and mid-rise SEP, which has dual occupancy.
Right. Okay. Okay. And that's still, and we're still waiting for that to be finalised. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct, Will.
Right. Okay. Great.
Good.
I'm just aware of the time. We have 5 more minutes and we have 23 questions. I'll get through as many as we can, and hopefully we'll be able to address them all. So moving swiftly on. HCAs were assessed as low integrity and high integrity. There is absolutely variations across HCAs as per Council's report. Why are low integrity HCAs being kept and high integrity HCAs being lost? So why there's a perception that the high grade ones are being lost and the lower ones are not. Any thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose in the first instance, across the scenarios, there is certainly a range of scenario HCAs that are kept or lost, and they definitely vary in their in terms of integrity. But yeah, so scenario 2A, most of the HCAs are actually lost.
Yep.
And 2B, similarly with 2A, there's quite a large proportion there.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, there's another question. It seems that scenario 1 is the only egalitarian option. Every other scenario disadvantages either individual houses or groups of houses. Won't this just lead to more litigation against council? Has council factored this in? And if so, what is the budget for this, which will ultimately be paid for by the ratepayers? So is there a legal risk here? Does anyone have a view on that?
If council goes through a proper statutory process of putting in place alternate rezonings, then that should not be challengeable. There are processes under the Environmental Planning and Assessment Act on how these things are done, and as long as we follow those processes, then that should not be challengeable.
Okay. Now, we're probably not going to be able to get through all the questions, but I'll just do a few more, and any that we haven't addressed, we'll look to address online. So given your answer about assuming that a road provides adequate transition zone, I must note that it does not. It is absurd to suggest that having the flexibility to allow a 5-story rather than an 8-story development will be a good outcome for a development across the road. I'll take that as a comment. How likely is it to build multi-level apartments over the railway at Gordon?
It's not unlikely. It's possible. So there's land on either side of the railway in that north of the rail station, some owned by council and some owned by Transport for New South Wales. So it wouldn't necessarily have to stretch over the railway, but it's certainly possible.
Okay, thank you. Why does scenario 3B have blue-coloured properties in Bayswater, which includes strata apartments, but not the apartments north of Shirley Road, leaving a missing tooth? Any thoughts on that?
Which were the streets?
Shirley Road.
3B.
Yes.
Why does it have apartments north of Shirley Road?
Yeah, sorry, I'm just going.
There's possibly up near the highway.
Sure.
I think the missing tooth there might be there's existing apartment buildings which are quite large number of owners there.
Okay. Now I'm just aware of. Sorry, Craig, you go.
I was just going to, on that particular issue, I was just going to jump in, and it applies to a few others, site-specific things that have come up. I just like to make the statement that what we've done at the moment is still a very high-level analysis, and once we get some direction from council on what the preferred options are, then we can actually dive in and look at the small site-specific details.
Yep.
So I encourage those people, like that last question,
Yep.
to put those site-specific issues in your submission, and then we can look at that in detail.
Yep. Okay. Now, I'm afraid we are out of time. We do still have 22 outstanding questions, but we will be looking to address those online in the next few days. Also, as Craig just said, if you do have site-specific questions, please let us know. If you can just drop an email to us at housing@krg.nsw.gov.au. We also have other events coming up. We have 2 public meetings, one on the 25th of November, which is next Monday in Council Chamber, and one on Monday the 9th of December in Council Chamber. We also have drop-in sessions, and the drop-in sessions are an opportunity for you to come and have a chat with staff. They can possibly answer some more specific questions to your property or certainly your local area. So again, as I mentioned, 2nd of December, which is a Monday at Council Chambers from 5 till 7 p.m. Saturday, the 7th of December, that's at Gordon Library. And we also have a lot of information on our website. So if you go to either the council website and go into the Your Say section, there is a link to our engagement page, which has the scenarios, has all the maps, all the plans. You can also find this via our engagement hub page. If you look on all the information that's been sent out and on our website, you'll see all the links there. What I'd like to do is thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to Bill and Craig and everybody else who's contributed this evening. As mentioned earlier, this is being recorded. We will aim to get this up online so you can peruse this at your leisure. The video that you saw briefly at the end of Bill's presentation, we will be looking to get that online as soon as possible. And then you can go through that at your own pace as well. You can look at the 3D buildings and get a better understanding of what each scenario means. I really encourage you to to complete our survey as well. That's on our website. So if you could complete that, that's being run by an independent external company to give it the weight that it deserves. And also, if you'd like to make any specific comments, please write to us at the email address, and we will look to address all of those matters. This whole process is going till the 17th of December, after which we'll be analysing all the feedback that we have received, and then we will be looking to make a recommendation early next year, and we'll see where that goes with our council. So I do thank you very much for coming this evening, and we look forward to either seeing you at some of our upcoming events, or certainly we'll be in touch with the outcomes of the process. So thank you very much for coming, and we will see you soon, hopefully. Thank you. Bye-bye.